May 1945. Nazi Germany was collapsing. Hitler was dead. Berlin was burning. But inside a remote castle in the Austrian Alps, American soldiers would soon fight side by side with German troops against the Nazis themselves. High in the mountains of Austria stood Itter Castle, centuries old, isolated, surrounded by forests and steep roads. But by 1945, the Nazis had turned the castle into a prison, and not just for ordinary prisoners. Inside were some of France's most important political figures, former prime ministers, generals, resistance leaders, valuable hostages waiting for the Third Reich to collapse around them. By May 1945, Germany was falling apart. Nazi officers were fleeing, soldiers were deserting, entire units were surrendering without firing a shot. But the Waffen-SS refused to stop fighting. Even after Hitler's death, many SS troops believed Germany could still survive, and they considered anyone trying to surrender a traitor. Then something strange happened at Castle Itter. The SS guards disappeared. One by one they abandoned the castle and fled into the mountains. Suddenly the prisoners were alone. No guards, no protection, no idea who controlled the roads outside. And somewhere in the forest surrounding the castle, armed SS soldiers were still hiding. The prisoners realized something terrifying. They had survived the Nazis only to become trapped in a castle surrounded by fanatics who still wanted them dead. And help was nowhere in sight. Desperate, the prisoners knew they had only one chance to survive. Someone had to escape the castle and find help before the SS returned. A Yugoslav prisoner named Zvonimir Chuchkovic volunteered for the mission. Under cover of darkness, he slipped out of Castle Itter and disappeared into the forests below. Every road was dangerous. German soldiers were still roaming the countryside, and nobody knew who was surrendering and who was still loyal to Hitler. For hours, Chuchkovic moved through the mountains alone. Cold wind, empty villages, burned vehicles abandoned beside the roads. Germany was collapsing so fast that entire towns no longer had any government at all. Then finally he found what he was searching for. American troops. The soldiers belonged to the 23rd Tank Battalion of the U.S. Army. Exhausted and covered in dirt, Chuchkovic tried to explain the impossible situation unfolding inside the castle. French prisoners trapped in the Alps, SS troops nearby, a fortress surrounded by danger. At first, the Americans barely believed him. The war was almost over. Berlin had already fallen. Hitler was dead. Yet somehow, hidden in the Austrian mountains, a final battle was about to begin. But the Americans weren't the only ones preparing to fight. Nearby, a German Wehrmacht officer named Major Josef Gangl had also realized the SS were becoming more dangerous than the Allies themselves. Gangl was no longer fighting for Nazi Germany. Now he was trying to protect Austrian civilians from fanatical SS troops who refused to surrender. And soon, he would make an unbelievable decision. He would join forces with the Americans. Major Josef Gangl knew the war was over. Germany was collapsing. Entire Nazi units were surrendering across Europe. But in the Austrian mountains, the Waffen-SS were becoming even more dangerous. Fanatical SS troops roamed from village to village, hunting deserters, executing anyone they believed had betrayed the Reich, and threatening civilians who only wanted the fighting to end. Gangl could see exactly where this was heading. The SS were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting out of hatred and desperation. So instead of following his final orders from Berlin, Gangl made a decision that could have gotten him executed for treason. He turned against the Nazis. Alongside a small group of loyal German soldiers, Gangl began secretly helping local Austrian civilians survive the final days of the war. He warned villages about SS movements, protected civilians from violence, and refused to let fanatics destroy what little remained of the country. Then word reached him about Castle Itter, French prisoners trapped inside a fortress, SS troops gathering nearby, and American forces somewhere beyond the mountains. Gangl understood immediately. If the SS reached the castle first, everyone inside would die. So in one of the strangest alliances of World War II, a German Wehrmacht officer prepared to join forces with the United States Army. And deep in the Austrian Alps, the final battle was beginning to take shape. On May 5, 1945, the strange alliance finally began moving toward Castle Itter. American tanks rolled through the Austrian valleys while Major Joseph Gangl and his German soldiers guided them through the mountains. Just days earlier, they had been enemies. Now they were fighting on the same side. The small rescue force was dangerously outnumbered. Only a handful of American troops, a few Wehrmacht soldiers, one Sherman tank named Besotten Jenny, and somewhere ahead, fanatical SS troops were already preparing to attack the castle. As they climbed higher into the Alps, the roads became narrower and more dangerous. Burned vehicles lined the mountain paths. Bridges had been destroyed. Smoke still drifted from villages caught in the collapse of the Third Reich. Then finally, through the fog and pine forests, Castle Itter appeared above the cliffs. Silent, isolated, waiting. Inside the fortress, the French prisoners watched nervously from the windows as American and German soldiers approached together. For a moment, nobody could believe what they were seeing, but there was almost no time to celebrate. Scouts soon reported movement in the forest surrounding the castle. Waffen-SS troops were closing in from every direction. The defenders quickly prepared the castle for battle. Windows became firing positions. Barricades were built inside the gates. Ammunition was distributed room by room. And parked outside the main entrance stood the defenders' greatest weapon, the American Sherman tank. By nightfall, Castle Itter had become a fortress once again. And deep in the Austrian mountains, Americans and Germans prepared to make their final stand together. Dawn broke over Castle Itter beneath thick mountain fog. The defenders had barely slept. Every sound in the forest made men reach for their rifles. Every movement beyond the trees felt like the beginning of the attack. Then, just after sunrise, the first shots rang out from the woods. Waffen-SS soldiers emerged from the forest surrounding the castle, firing from the trees and rocky slopes above the road. Bullets slammed into the stone walls as the defenders rushed to their positions. American soldiers fired from the windows while German Wehrmacht troops defended the gates beside them. Inside the castle, French prisoners carried ammunition, treated the wounded, and prepared for the possibility that nobody would survive the day. The fighting quickly became chaotic. Smoke filled the courtyards. Rifle fire echoed through the mountains. The narrow roads made it almost impossible for reinforcements to arrive. Outside the entrance, the Sherman tank Besotten Jenny opened fire on the surrounding hillsides, its cannon shaking the entire fortress with every blast. For a moment, the tank kept the SS pinned down, but the defenders had one major problem. They were running dangerously low on ammunition. The SS knew it too. More troops began moving through the forests, slowly surrounding the castle from every side. Snipers appeared in the trees. Machine guns opened fire from the cliffs above. Then suddenly a massive explosion shook Castle Itter. The Sherman tank had been hit. Flames erupted from the vehicle parked outside the gates as smoke poured into the mountain air. The defenders watched in horror as their greatest weapon burned in front of them. Now the castle stood almost defenseless, and the SS were closing in. The defenders inside Castle Itter knew they could not survive much longer. Ammunition was nearly gone. The Sherman tank was destroyed, and the SS continued tightening their grip around the fortress. Every hallway echoed with gunfire and shouting. Smoke drifted through the castle corridors as wounded soldiers were dragged into makeshift medical rooms. Outside, the sound of machine guns rolled through the mountains like thunder, yet nobody inside the castle surrendered. American troops, German Wehrmacht soldiers, and French prisoners continued fighting side by side, defending windows, staircases, and barricades room by room. Then tragedy struck. Major Joseph Gangel rushed across an exposed section of the courtyard to protect former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud from sniper fire. As Gangel reached him, a shot rang out from the forest. Gangel collapsed instantly. The German officer who had turned against Hitler, the man who chose to defend civilians and fight beside the Americans, had been killed by an SS sniper. Inside the castle, the defenders were devastated. But the attack was growing even worse. SS troops were now reaching the outer walls. Some defenders began preparing for a final last stand inside the main halls of the fortress. Then suddenly, through the smoke and chaos, a new sound echoed through the valley. Engines. Reinforcements were finally arriving. American troops from the 142nd Infantry Regiment stormed toward Castle Itter, breaking through the SS lines surrounding the fortress. Caught between defenders inside the castle and fresh American forces outside, the SS attack finally began to collapse. By the afternoon of May 5, 1945, the battle was over. Against impossible odds, Castle Itter had survived, and in one of the strangest moments of World War II, Americans and Germans had fought side by side against the Nazis, inside a medieval castle in the Austrian Alps.